In the 5th year of our relationship, Damien, a wedding dress designer, proposed to me. The moment the engagement ring was on my finger, he promised, "Clara, I will design the most beautiful wedding dress for you." But until the eve of the wedding, Damien walked into the wedding hall with Seraphina, wearing the wedding dress that should have been mine. At the wedding they embraced, kissed and made romantic vows. Back home I asked him for an explanation. He raised an eyebrow nonchalantly saying, "It's just for show, why are you being so petty? Besides, Seraphina is dying, can't you be more generous?" Upon hearing this, I neither cried nor made a scene but said, "Then let's call off the engagement, you go be with Seraphina." As soon as the words fell, the entire room fell silent. A storm of anger was brewing in the man's eyes, his hands clenched into fists, his fingertips turning white with force. He stood up abruptly and said word by word, "Clara, say that again." Closed my eyes, 100 kinds of despair swirling in my heart. Whenever I said something that displeased him, Damien would always get angry and make me repeat it. In the past, to take care of his emotions, I would always back down again and again. I never repeated words that would hurt him, but now I lowered my gaze and my voice was slow but firm. I said, "Let's call off our engagement." Clang! Damien smashed everything on the table to the ground. Many glass and porcelain bowls shattered into pieces, fragments flying onto my exposed skin, bringing a sharp pain. The man was visibly livid, his chest rising and falling violently. "Clara!" he shouted my name loudly. "Just because of this small matter you want to abandon our years of relationship? You're so heartless." The harsh insults were like sharp knives piercing my heart. At that moment a soft push of the door was heard. Seraphina, wearing the dress Damien had specially designed for her, stood in the study, looking over curiously, a touch of spoiled arrogance on her face. "Damien, I want that red dress." As soon as Damien's gaze fell upon Seraphina, he took a breath, his eyes filled with tender smiles. He quickly went up to her, took Seraphina's hand, and spoke with a voice as soft as melting snow. "After I finish designing the sketches tomorrow, okay?" When facing Seraphina, Damien never had any bottom line. Seraphina could freely enter and leave the study, where he never allowed anyone to go. And I, his fiancée, could only enter when the room needed cleaning. "Did you guys have an argument?" Seraphina asked, looking at me, a hint of pity in her eyes. When mentioning me, Damien frowned. "She's not even worth getting angry over. Just an untrustworthy liar." The man sneered, making no attempt to hide his words. I noticed almost immediately that Seraphina was wearing those heels. Those were the shoes I had especially bought for our wedding. I had waited half a year for them, only to finally receive them yesterday. I didn't know that Miss Seraphina had a hobby of stealing other people's things. I spoke in a cold voice. As soon as the words fell, Seraphina almost immediately burst into tears, her face covered with tears. She clutched Damien's sleeve and said in a choked voice, "Damien, I didn't know. I just thought they looked nice, I'm sorry." With that, she made a move to take off the shoes. Damien's face darkened completely, he stopped Seraphina from moving, turned to me, and raised his hand. The moment the slap landed, an unmistakable throbbing pain hit me. I stared blankly, my head tilted. It finally dawned on me that Damien had slapped me. The man's angry voice came from above my head. "You're really getting out of hand, it's just a pair of shoes. Is it necessary to humiliate Seraphina like this? Besides, a cripple with a missing leg, is there even a need to wear such expensive shoes?" Damien threw down the sentence and left with Seraphina's hand in his. My heart felt bitter and tears silently fell. He was used to rubbing salt on my wounds, but he seemed to have forgotten for whom I had lost that leg. In the huge house, joyful red decorations were hung everywhere. Everything was decorated by Damien, especially for Seraphina. The image of Damien's frowning, annoyed face flashed in my mind. His words echoed in my ears. "Just having a wedding without even registering. When did you become so petty?" Everything fell silent. I lowered my head and looked at my prosthetic leg. My posture stiff and unnatural. Anyone could see that it was an artificial limb. 2 years ago, when Damien and I were out together, a fast-moving car suddenly darted out of nowhere. Seeing that it was closing in, I used all my strength to push Damien away, but my own leg was crushed under the wheel. Amidst the chaos, blood flowed like a river. I couldn't even feel the pain. I just saw Damien staggering towards me. That day I lost a leg for him, and he cried uncontrollably, his hands and feet numb. Clara, from now on, you are my only one. I don't want anyone but you. I deeply believed in that sentence then. But then Seraphina appeared. In the beginning, Damien would always complain to me, Clara, you have no idea how annoying she is. She follows me around all the time. Seraphina was the daughter of Damien's teacher. Damien had to tolerate all this. But slowly, when Damien mentioned her, his eyes would fill with joy. He began to leave early and return late just to spend more time with Seraphina. Even if I argued or made a fuss, Damien would still go to be with Seraphina. Until the day before yesterday, Seraphina, who had been energetic, was diagnosed with terminal stomach cancer. To fulfill her wish, Damien held a wedding for her. That gorgeous, beautiful wedding dress was worn by Seraphina. Everyone praised the two of them for being a perfect match. I cried all night, my pillow covered with tear stains. But now I watched Damien and Seraphina slowly disappear. My heart was without any wave. The next day I packed my bags. Just as I was opening the door, I bumped into Damien, who was returning home. He was carrying a box, and I saw the cake under the clear lid. Catching sight of the suitcase behind me, Damien's brow visibly wrinkled. Are you going to use this run-away-from-home trick again? He chuckled vaguely, seemingly not taking the matter to heart. After all, I used to try to get Damien's attention by pretending to run away from home with a suitcase. After a few times, Damien had found that he could win me back just with a few words of coaxing. But obviously, he didn't know that I had made up my mind to leave. Suddenly, a big hand fell on my shoulder and with undeniable force turned me around. Damien raised the cake in his hand. It's your favorite. Before I could speak, Damien said, just accept this as a way down the stairs. After you're done, hurry up and apologize to Seraphina. She can't be emotionally agitated, you know that, right? He didn't even care about what I wanted, but forcefully arranged what I should do next. Perhaps in his heart, I was always acting unreasonably. I didn't say a word. I looked at the colorful sugar beads on the cake. A sweet aroma permeated the air. I felt inexplicably irritated just because of those few pieces of mango on the cake. After who knows how long, I spoke slowly. You've forgotten again that I'm allergic to mangoes. 5 years was enough time to understand a person's temperament and habits. But Damien seemed like he had never cared about me at all. He could even forget about my allergy to mangoes. The man raised an eyebrow carelessly, saying, You can't eat this, you can't eat that. Clara, when did you become so fussy? A sense of powerlessness grew in my heart. So I stretched out my hand and knocked the small exquisite cake to the ground. The sticky cream splattered, no longer as appetizing as before. Damien was stunned, followed by overwhelming anger. He avoided the pile of cream on the floor and grabbed my wrist. His grip was so tight that I felt like he was about to crush my bones. It was raining outside the window, raindrops hitting the glass, like a flurry of hurried drumbeats. What's wrong with you now? I spent so much effort to please you. I waited in line for an hour to get this cake. You just smash it like that? He was furious, his eyes bloodshot like an enraged lion. Let me tell you, you're not 1/10 as good as Seraphina. Don't you want to run away from home? Fine, go out right now. Let's see who would like a cripple like you besides me. Damien pointed angrily at the door, his face filled with aggression. But from beginning to end I remained calm like an indifferent outsider. Hearing this, I stepped 1 foot out the door. Before I could turn around, Damien threw my suitcase out of the door. Get out. Never appear before me again. Through the layer of rain, the man's features were blurry, but that cold, icy face was still engraved in my heart. Many images suddenly flashed before my eyes, but they were all of Damien's face, still particularly young and naive. From meeting, knowing to loving, I had been through a lot with him. Slowly, The face in my memory merged with Damien's current face. Like a dream, I didn't stay and turned away. After leaving Damien, I went to the hospital without stopping. I had promised my grandmother that I would see her today. The moment she saw me, my grandmother's worry-filled face turned into a smile. "Clara, you finally arrived." As soon as I sat down, she kept stuffing food into my hands. I accepted it all with a smile. Grandma still rambled on like before, pulling me to talk about many things. But this time I noticed that she kept mentioning one person, Dr. Song. Just as I was puzzled, the door was gently pushed open, and a faint sound of footsteps was heard. I looked up and saw a young man in a white coat, holding a medical record. My grandmother's face immediately showed a hint of joy. "Clara, this is Dr. Song." It turned out that Julian was my grandmother's attending physician. The man smiled gently, exchanged a few pleasantries with my grandmother, and then called me outside. Various people were walking past us in the long corridor. Julian briefly introduced my grandmother's condition with a few simple words. "The patient has been recovering well recently. If possible, you can buy more nutritious foods for the elderly." Oh. I listened intently to his words. I didn't pay attention to my step for a moment, and just as I was losing my balance and about to fall to the side, Julian firmly grabbed my wrist. "Be careful." The man's slightly deep voice exploded in my ear. My face flushed. Before I could steady myself, a familiar voice came from behind me. "Found a new one so quickly? Did you tell him that you're a cripple with a missing leg?" Damien's face was dark as he walked slowly towards me. I saw the jealousy hidden in his eyes. Whether it was before or now, Damien never allowed a place for any male friend to remain by my side. In the past, I always thought it was because Damien was too insecure. So I would always indulge him unconditionally, and there were very few men in my phone contacts. But now, looking back, it was only Damien's possessiveness acting out. Straighten my body and release Julian. "That should not concern you in any way." Damien sneered, his gaze falling on Julian. "So you know how to find a doctor now? Are you trying to get money from him?" I frowned. Before I could speak, he continued, "I'll give you one more chance. As long as you lower your head and admit your mistake, I will continue to pay for Grandma's medical expenses." With a few words, Damien seemed to be sure that I had always been using his bank card. But he didn't know that for the past few years, I hadn't touched a penny of the money in his bank account. Julian, who had always had a gentle temper, frowned, put down the medical record in his hand, and shielded me from him. Seeing this, Damien's eyebrows narrowed in anger. He rushed over and grabbed my arm. Just as he was about to use force, Seraphina, wearing blue and white hospital clothes, walked over. Her eyes were slightly red. Her hair was neat yet slightly messy. Her lips were pouting slightly, showing her fragility. As soon as Damien saw her, he instantly cooled down, even releasing my arm as if he had been shocked. "Damien, don't you want me anymore?" After that, she sobbed softly. "Right, I'm going to die soon anyway. You don't need to waste your time on me either." Damien held Seraphina in his arms with heartache and gently comforted her. Suddenly he paused, as if remembering something. "Clara, you still owe Seraphina an apology." The man pursed his lips and spoke coldly, fell silent, like the prelude to a coming storm. I looked directly at Damien. Why should I? It was clearly Seraphina who had taken the wedding dress that should have been mine. It was clearly Damien who had hurt me again and had let me down. Yet, in the end, I was asked to apologize. Passers-by no longer left, but stopped like spectators, whispering amongst themselves. Amidst the noise, Seraphina was crying more aggrievedly. The fringe in front of Damien's eyes blocked his sight, making it impossible to see the emotions in his eyes. He brushed past Julian in front of me and was about to throw me to the ground. "You should apologize if you make a mistake. Do you think Seraphina has no one to protect her?" he said loudly, like a demon trying to claim a life. I lost my balance and fell to the ground with a thud. That prosthetic leg with a prosthetic foot was placed on the ground in an extremely stiff manner. The surrounding people were talking even more loudly. Almost all their attention was focused on my leg. I should have let everyone know. Clara is just a cripple who can never be on the stage. Julian was the first to react. He pushed Damien's hand away. Under everyone's shocked gaze, he bent over and picked me up. "Are you okay?" he asked me softly. I shook my head and slowly took out a voice recorder from my pocket. My heart seemed to have died the moment I fell to the ground. 5 years of relationship had turned into a bubble. I pressed the play button without hesitation. A clear, gentle female voice came out. If I didn't pretend to be sick to deceive him, how would I be able to win his heart back? "Aren't you afraid that he'll find out?" The entire recording was played. Seraphina's face had already lost all color, her lips trembling uncontrollably. Damien, however, seemed much calmer, if ignoring his trembling fingertips and the daze in his eyes. Seraphina panicked. She reached out and grabbed the man's sleeve, like a drowning person clutching at the last straw. "Damien, let me explain. It was all Clara's fault for framing me." Big tears ran down Seraphina's face, looking particularly pitiful. Usually Damien couldn't stand her looking so pitiful. But now Damien struggled, but didn't hesitate to shake off Seraphina's hand. He stepped towards me, helplessly reaching out as if he wanted to touch me. But finally he gave up and his arm fell weakly. "Clara." He softly called my name. I felt disgusted. "It's my fault, let's go home," he pleaded, his entire being surrounded by an ever-growing panic. His lips were even turning pale. Couldn't use strength in my legs because I fell too hard. So I had to tug Julian's clothes. "Let's go," I said without any mercy. Julian understood. He curled his lips into a smile to Damien. "Sorry, she now." Julian dragged out the end of his sentence and continued, "Doesn't seem to want to go home with you." Perhaps it was Julian's smile that was too dazzling. Damien's eyes had more red veins, and the corners of his eyes were faintly red. His face was full of resentment. "Clara, for 5 whole years, I don't believe you can really let go." But I laughed in the same way that Damien was so indifferent back then. "No, I will let go. After all, it's your mistake in the first place. You clearly know how much I value that wedding dress, yet you still carelessly gave it to Seraphina. You also know that I would be sad because of this, but you still disregarded my collapse. I don't want that wedding dress. I don't want you either." Damien was stunned. Julian turned around carrying me. The crowd slowly moved away, leaving only a stunned Damien and a tearful Seraphina in place. Since I met Julian, my life seemed to have become filled with a little more joy for no reason. He spoke gently, acted carefully, and would always ask me out in his spare time. We became closer and closer, and in the end, it seemed that only a thin layer of paper separated us. Damien also slowly faded out of my life, until one day Damien called me. On the other side, he spoke very carefully, no longer as arrogant as he used to be. "Clara, can you come home again when you are free? There are still some of your things at home, you can come get them." The irritation was spreading. I stopped working, my voice as indifferent as if I was facing a stranger. "I don't want them, just throw them away." After that I hung up the phone decisively, ignoring what Damien was about to say. But he called back again relentlessly. By the time I hung up the phone for the 10th time, he finally stopped. But I didn't expect that Damien would wait for me at the hospital. He seemed to have dressed up carefully to see me. His hair was neatly combed, and he was wearing a suit that was quite familiar to me. It was a suit that I had given him years ago. Only today was he finally willing to wear it. The red roses in the man's arms were too eye-catching, attracting the attention of many people. Noticing my gaze falling on that suit, Damien's eyes showed a hint of triumph. "Clara, I was wrong before. These days I think of nothing but you." Damien moved, still wanting to say something. But I interrupted him. "From the moment you held a wedding with Seraphina, you are no longer worthy of mentioning us." Damien's eyes darkened like dark clouds gathering. He pursed his lips, the corners of his mouth rigid. "Clara, I only made a small mistake. And you know how much my teacher's kindness means to me. Seraphina is still just a young girl, although she did lie. But all of this is understandable. Even now Damien was still protecting Seraphina. I suddenly thought of that day. I was in the middle of my passionate relationship with Damien and asked him, "Damien, will you unconditionally protect me in the future?" Damien then smiled helplessly and reached out to mess up my hair. "What silly things are you asking? You're my girlfriend, of course I will always stand behind you." But now he had indeed unconditionally protected someone. But that person was not me. My thoughts returned. I didn't want to waste any more time with him, and just as I was about to leave, Damien grabbed my hand in a panic. "Clara, I saw that your walking posture is not quite right. Is your prosthetic rubbing too much?" Looking back, I saw the concern in the man's eyes. I suddenly felt a bit dazed. I remembered that once I accidentally passed by Damien's study. He seemed to be on the phone. "Clara." I heard my name and stopped subconsciously. "Cut it out," I tricked her into letting me see that prosthetic leg. I was almost disgusted to death. It was like half a meatball. Just that one look and I didn't eat for 3 days. Then the person on the other end of the phone seemed to make a joke. Damien laughed and cursed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. If it weren't for me that she became like that, I would have never been able to hold on this long. It's still more fun to have a girlfriend like Seraphina. That day I almost collapsed. I frantically searched my memory for any memory of Damien loving me, trying to comfort myself with that. Cold tears ran down my face. A big crack appeared in my heart, as if tears were constantly flowing out. Perhaps it was at that moment that the idea of leaving was planted. Now when looking at Damien's face again, everything had turned into a fake display of affection. At that time an abrupt phone ring went off. Damien's body clearly stiffened. Letting the ringtone ring for a few seconds, he finally answered the phone. "Damien, I think I have a fever. There's no one at home. I'm so scared." A voice that aroused pity drilled into my ears. Damien's eyes were evasive, not daring to look at me. He said in a low voice, "Aren't there any medicines at home?" The voice on the other end sounded even weaker, as if she was about to faint at any moment. "Forget it. I knew you were still resenting me." I frowned and heavily shook off Damien's hand. I sneered. "She's about to die. Aren't you going to see her?" The man's brows furrowed, seemingly very dissatisfied with what I said. "Clara, Seraphina is just sick. There's no need for you to curse her." "I don't understand why, as soon as it involves Seraphina. You're so harsh, like a shrew." After he finished, Damien agreed to Seraphina in front of me. He put his phone back, looked at me with unkind eyes and threw the roses in his hand into the trash can. "You should change your temper in the future. No one will be able to tolerate you except me." The originally tender rose petals were scattered and crushed. After being thrown away with force, Damien left without looking back. His steps were extremely fast, as if he was in a hurry to see someone important. If it had been 3 years ago, I might have been afraid of being abandoned and chased after him. Damien had long figured out this about me. So every time after an argument in public, Damien would always walk away with a cold face. It was only when he saw that I was following him anxiously that Damien would give me a good look and accept my apology. But things had changed. I no longer cast my gaze on Damien for a second and turned towards the ward. For 5 consecutive days, Damien did not appear in front of me. Julian noticed that I had been in a bad mood lately, so he took the opportunity to ask me out. The meeting point was a quiet beach. Not far away, colorful little lights were placed everywhere, glistening under the moonlight. I looked around for a long time, but still couldn't find Julian's figure. It seemed that he was intentionally hiding. Suddenly, a passerby handed me a bouquet of white bellflowers, smiling as he said, "Someone is waiting for you up ahead." A hidden sense of anticipation rose in my heart. I walked forward slowly. More and more people handed me bellflowers, until I could no longer hold any more. In my arms, Julian entered, dressed in a white suit. I was still a bit dazed even when he stood in front of me. "Clara, can I be your boyfriend?" The man's eyes sparkled with laughter. People around me started to cheer. My vision was a bit blurry. I was aware of my heart beating wildly for Julian. Just as I was about to agree, Damien squeezed out of the crowd. His hair was messy, and he had lost one of his shoes with one foot ridiculously stepped on the sand. The air was filled with the faint smell of sea salt. Damien and Julian and I became the center of attention in the crowd. Clara, you can't agree to him. The man smiled, the smile even uglier than crying. People around him began to yell in dissatisfaction. He's confessing, what are you doing here? Go down and don't ruin other people's good time. Damien's face was getting paler and paler, and his body was starting to sway. But he still refused to leave, stubbornly looking at me, his eyes glistening with tears. Please, don't agree to him. Seeing that I didn't respond, Damien even tried to grab my wrist. But Julian reacted too fast. He had already shielded me behind him before Damien could even reach out. Move. Damien squeezed the words out of his throat. Julian frowned. Just as he was about to raise his leg, I stopped him. It's not worth it for this kind of person, I said indifferently, tightly holding Julian's hand and stood by his side. Damien was stunned. It seemed like he didn't expect that Clara, who had always favored him, would so resolutely choose Julian at this moment. His eyes turned red and he rushed up to engage in a fight with Julian. The sounds of fists hitting flesh came one after another. I was pushed aside by the crowd trying to break up the fight. The scene turned into chaos. I could have sworn I had heard Damien yell, "Clara is mine. No one can take her away." In Damien's heart, I had perhaps already become his possession. He was sure that I wouldn't leave him, so he was able to become more and more comfortable with Seraphina. I remembered once I had a high fever in the middle of the night and was forced to call Damien. But he just said lightly, "Then quickly go to the hospital." I did not miss the sound of Seraphina's coquettish laughter on the other end of the phone. "Damien, hurry up and cook," she told Damien with spoiled tone. Damien didn't have any reluctance, instead I could hear a trace of fondness. I understand. But when he faced me again, Damien began to become impatient. He asked me, "Is there anything else?" A tightness in my throat. I almost couldn't speak. "Can you?" "I will hang up if there isn't anything." I and he spoke at the same time. By the time I realized it, Damien had already hung up the phone. My heart was slightly tight. See, Damien had never even been to the kitchen a few times at home. Thinking that he was busy with work, I never let him cook. But now, Damien was willing to cook for Seraphina. Scar after scar piled up, causing pain. I pushed through the crowd and stood in front of Damien. My voice was light and quiet, but enough for everyone to hear clearly. "Damien, let go of my boyfriend." It was as if a pause button had been pressed, and both men stopped. I bent over and helped Julian up, carefully checking the man's injuries. Julian touched my face, bringing a touch of coolness. He smiled and reassured. "I'm fine." I looked at the bruises on his mouth, the anger in my heart growing. Damien also stood up, staggering. The injuries on his body seemed to be more severe than Julian, and his way of walking was awkward. "Clara, I'm in so much pain." Damien lowered his gaze, his eyes filled with grievance. In the past, I always liked to keep some medicine for bruises and sprains at home, just because Damien always didn't look where he was going when he was in his own world, which led to many bruises. Every time this happened, he would always go to my side with grievance and cry, "Clara, I'm in pain." And I would always help him apply the medicine, despite my harsh words. Julian suddenly pulled my hand tightly, as if afraid that I would turn back. "Do you know what you look like now?" I suddenly said to Damien, but before he could respond, "Like a disgusting stray dog." I said word by word, my pronunciation especially clear. "It's pointless for you to entangle me. I will not forget the pain you brought me, and I will remember it clearly." This was more like a slow and cruel torture towards Damien. The sea breeze kept blowing. Damien's clothes fluttered, his lips pale, his face full of disbelief. I held Julian's hand and left the beach under his gaze. This time he didn't stop me. Or perhaps he also knew that he wouldn't be able to stop me. From that day onwards, Damien seemed to have changed, and in order to see me, he began to block me at my doorstep. I drove him away again and again in annoyance. He gradually stopped. But when I opened my grandmother's ward, the person in my line of sight was actually Damien. He sat on the companion chair, lowering his head as he was peeling an apple. Even with Grandmother's words. Damien, who had never been patient, would respond from time to time. I had never told grandmother about my and Damien's matter. Seeing that I had come, Damien stood up and took a box from behind him. Clara, I've been making this dress for a long time. Do you like it? Damien nervously opened the box, and inside there was a gorgeous long dress. It was covered with shiny pearls. Damien seemed to have put a lot of effort into this dress. But I had been asking for this dress for 2 years. Over the past 2 years, I had always told Damien that I wanted a dress designed by him, but he never took it to heart. Even when he was free, he would always deal with it perfunctorily. But Seraphina was different. As long as she asked, Damien would rush to design the draft, and then sew it by hand. He was incredibly indulgent towards Seraphina, but to me there was only impatience. This dress came at the wrong time. I shook my head. I don't need it anymore. The light in Damien's eyes seemed to have fallen. He forced a smile and said, "Then I interrupted him, my voice even calmer and more natural. Do you need me to repeat myself again? Grandma could tell that there was tension between me and him. She began to ask about my relationship with Damien. I was afraid that grandmother would worry, so I had to lie that he was a friend. Damien finally walked out of the ward with me. Just as we stepped into a quiet place, the man grabbed my sleeve, his voice pleading. Clara, I know you won't forgive me, but I beg you not to leave me. We've been together for so many years. You know, I can't live without you. With that, Damien, who had always been most concerned about his reputation, actually knelt down in front of me. Then he took out a ring. It was the design of the wedding ring that I had already picked. His hands were trembling faintly, but he was still stubbornly holding that ring up. Once I had fantasized countless times about the scenario of marrying Damien. It would be romantic or heartwarming. Fireworks and salutes would be plentiful. Even in every night, I would always be immersed in the married life that I had imagined. But reality wasn't like that. Damien was far less beautiful than I had imagined. He could hurt my heart again and again for Seraphina, forcing me to collapse in despair. 1,000 thoughts returned. I reached out my hand. Under Damien's hopeful gaze, I took the ring but didn't put it on my hand. Instead, I raised my arm and with a strong flick, the ring fell into the lake with a swoosh. Ripples spread across the lake's surface, and finally sank into the lake without a trace. Damien, I already warned you. I would never change my own mind easily. Because of someone's actions. Those who lose me will lose me forever. When I finished speaking, everything became even more silent. Damien slowly raised his head and met my gaze. Only then did I notice that Damien's eyes had turned red, and 2 clear tear stains were hanging on his cheeks. Clara, if I fished the ring back up. Even though Damien had only said half a sentence, I still understood what he meant. I won't stop you. Damien jumped into the lake without hesitation. I didn't look at him again, and instead turned and left. As for whether he got the ring in the end, it had nothing to do with me. 2 hours later, when I was chatting with grandmother, I heard the nurse gossiping. I heard that Damien jumped into the lake and was in the emergency room. Now, what did he do that for? Who knows? Maybe he had an argument with his wife. That's impossible. Didn't they just get married recently? Hearing this, I continued what I was doing without any change of expression. 5 years had gone by, and no one even knew of my existence. Because Damien had never mentioned me in front of anyone. On the contrary, Damien had given Seraphina a grand wedding, which made her very popular. Everyone knew that the partner of the famous designer Damien was Seraphina. Grandma seemed to have noticed that something was wrong with me and patted my hand. Clara, who was that person just now? I smiled carelessly. A famous designer who's been married. He has nothing to do with me. I didn't expect Seraphina to find me. She was wearing a black mask and hat, completely covering herself. Only her eyes were showing, her hatred undisguised. Clara, you must be very proud of yourself right now. Because of you, Damien has kicked me out of his house. Facing this type of jealous fanatic, I lifted my foot and wanted to leave. But Seraphina grabbed my arm with a sharp eye and quick hand. Through my clothes I could feel the slow force of her long nails. If I'm not having a good time, then you won't either, she said with clear hatred. An uneasy emotion surged into my heart. I subconsciously wanted to call for help, but she was one step ahead and covered my mouth. The thing that I was most worried about had still happened. Seraphina took out a knife from her bag. The sunlight shone on the blade, reflecting a glaring white light. My legs seemed to have been nailed to the ground. I could only watch as the knife got closer and closer to me. My heart beat rapidly and I closed my eyes. The expected pain didn't come. Instead, I fell into a familiar embrace. At that moment, I seemed to hear the screams of passers-by. Then the sounds of the ambulance mixed together. By the time I had come to my senses again, Damien had already fallen at my feet due to excessive blood loss. Blood was flowing all over the ground, an eerie and frightening sight. But he managed to say, "Clara, I found the ring." The man slowly opened his palm, revealing the blood-stained ring. It was supposed to be an extremely moving scene, but I was still emotionless as I wiped the blood from my neck. Following the instructions of the paramedics, I left. Behind me, I seemed to have heard Damien's cries for me to stay, as small as the sound of mosquitoes fluttering. "Don't go. Please." But I still didn't turn back. The moment Damien handed the wedding dress to Seraphina, he should have expected this day. Afterward, Julian asked me jealously, "Would you feel soft-hearted because of this?" I was stunned. I suddenly thought of a sentence. An eye for an eye. I had lost a leg for Damien, and he had blocked a knife for me today. We were even now. With that in mind, I slowly shook my head and looked up to kiss Julian's lips. "No, I never will." Under the man's tender gaze, I answered softly, "The inn."